How good are you at holding your boundaries? What do you do when someone crosses your boundaries? What happens when somebody you love and deeply care about wants something from you and the answer is just no? How do you navigate that? Hi, this is Sara Russell. I'm a relationship coach, dancer, and Taoist. In every episode, I'll be talking about psychedelics, well-being, or the human experience, and this one is on the grief of holding boundaries. You know that scene in Lord of the Rings where Gandalf is down in the mines of Moria, and he's still Gandalf the Grey, he's not Gandalf the White yet, right? Because he's about to face the Balrog. And the Balrog is this huge monster of fire and shadow, right? And there's this moment where Gandalf is facing down the Balrog and he slams his staff down onto the ground and he yells, "You shall not pass." My mom says that's a bit like how I hold my boundaries. I'm an Enneagram 8, and for those of you that don't know what that is, the Enneagram is a personality system where, if I'm talking about it from the Riso Hudson perspective, there's this idea that you have your soul, right? And when you're little, something happens when you're tender and vulnerable and kind of powerless. Something happens to your soul that creates some kind of wound, and then personality swoops in to save the day. And in the Enneagram, our dominant personality is whichever personality type swooped in to save the day for us when we were little and hurting in some way. So for me, that's an Enneagram 8, and the Enneagram 8 is known as the challenger, which means we like to move against things. We're very disruptive, right? Martin Luther King Jr. was an Enneagram 8, so it's this counterculture, subversive, I don't like the way things are, so I'm going to shake things up, I'm going to change them, I'm going to try to make a better world kind of transformational energy, right? It also means that holding boundaries is one of my superpowers. I tend to be one of those people where somebody asks me a question and I go, no. Wait, what was the question? It's just easier for me to default to a no. I'm really clear on protecting my energy, knowing what I want, knowing what I don't want, which means that sometimes my boundaries can come across as a little rigid or a little aggressive or uncompromising or not empathetic enough, which means part of my journey as an Enneagram 8 has been to figure out, how do I tell somebody no with love? What happens when I'm in a relationship and I need to hold a boundary and I want there to still be care and connection expressed, and that it's not just me completely taking care of myself, not tracking what anybody else wants or needs, but for me to go, I understand we want something different right now and I really love you, and the answer is still no. So how do we define boundaries? What is a boundary? I want to start with what a boundary is not. So a boundary is not a way we control somebody else. So this is not about all of the rules and regulations and compromises that we make in our relationships. And when I say relationships, I mean all relationships, relationship anarchist. I'm not just talking about romantic sexual partners. I'm talking about family, friends, coworkers, etc. But it's all the rules, regulations, and compromises we make in order to keep that relationship going, all while resentment is building, right? So it's this idea that if we care about something, care about someone, we're supposed to compromise ourselves and what we want in order to make them happy, in order to make them feel at ease. And I am a huge fan of influencing one another. You influence me, I influence you. We take care of each other. We try to come up with solutions that work for both of us. But sometimes there's a real difference, and boundaries are not the way that we control each other's differences. Boundaries are also not about entitlement. This idea that if you have a history with a person, if you have a particular kind of relationship, they owe you something. Now, granted, they may owe you honesty, transparency, so that you can consent to the relationship. You have all the information you need to know. But that's not the same thing as if you love me, you'll do it, right? This idea that you have to prove that somebody is special to you by doing something that you want to do because they're so much more important to you. Their needs are more important than your needs, right? We have this cultural Cinderella idealism that if you love somebody, you're going to put their needs above yours. I'm not a big fan of that. I'm a big fan of everybody trying to take care of themselves and each other within cooperation rather than entitlement. Boundaries are not how we punish somebody. So this idea that we hold a boundary, so for instance, withholding or withdrawing affection as a way to tell somebody, I'm mad at you, I don't like what you did, And punishment and persecution is really different than natural consequences. So natural consequences would be you removing yourself as a way to self-soothe, as a way to regulate. I'm a big fan of that. But this idea of punishing somebody else, I'm not going to spend time with you because you didn't do what I wanted you to do, or the time that we do spend with each other is going to be all of this processing where I'm shaming and blaming you constantly. That's not why we have boundaries either. And boundaries shouldn't be threats. And so, I'll talk more about natural consequences later, but this idea, like, is your boundary a threat as a way to try to manipulate or coerce or control the other person? Or is your boundary coming from your preference? And one of the ways that you can figure that out is preferences we tend to enact eventually. Like maybe we need to build a skill set around holding our boundary, but we assert our preferences versus a threat where it's more like, if you don't, I will, or if you do, I won't, kind of if-then statements that don't always manifest. They don't materialize, right? It's just kind of like this ongoing threat that something's going to happen, but it doesn't actually happen, versus a preference, which ideally, would start to happen. Okay, so now what a boundary is. And I want to give you this quote from Prentice Hemphill, who's a movement facilitator and somatics teacher. And they say, boundaries give us the space to do the work of loving ourselves. They might be actually the first and fundamental expression of self-love. They also give us the space to love and witness others as they are, even those that hurt us. And Prentice Hemphill also says, and this is the famous quote, right? Boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. So boundaries are how we communicate what we do and what we do not want. And Nancy Chanteau talks about 3 different areas of boundaries that we have. And one of them is, how do we and how do we not want to be touched? How do we want to and not want to give our attention to something? And how do we and not want to interact with people in a shared space? So those are some areas that you can think about what your boundaries are, what your preferences are, what you want and what you don't want. Okay, now how do we hold a boundary? And for the sake of this podcast, I'm going to be talking about holding a boundary with somebody that you have relatively equal power with, or at least aren't in danger of, right? So this idea that it's safe for you to hold your boundary. If you're in a situation where you're not safe to hold your boundary, that's a topic for another time. And I can definitely get into that. Like, how do we hold our dignified differences and our boundaries when we're in a situation where there's a power imbalance and we're being power played? But for the sake of this, I'm going to assume relatively equal power, or at least enough power that you can enact your boundary safely. Holding a boundary is less about an idea, although it starts there, and it's more about taking an action, and that action is you creating space from whatever it was that violated your boundary by moving your body away. So a boundary is when you move your body away from something. So for instance, if you're in the middle of a text conversation and you're at work and you want to tell the person that you're talking to, like, this isn't a good time, you continually saying, please don't text me when I'm at work, I really can't continue this conversation. That's not actually you enacting your boundary. You enacting your boundary is the moment after you've said, I can't talk at work anymore, you put the phone down and stop responding. So it's the moment that you turn your attention away. You stop interacting in the way that you don't want to. Now, the grief in holding our boundaries can come from, like, sometimes we're moving our bodies away from somebody that we love, somebody that we want to spend time with, a connection that we really care about. But in that particular context, those particular conditionals aren't working for us. And so we may start limiting our time and energy with somebody we actually really love to be with. Holding a boundary might also include accepting the unacceptable about a situation where what we want isn't available, that the dream that we wanted, the way we wanted it to manifest, isn't going to happen. And so being able to move ourselves away from the expectation of what we wanted, that isn't going to happen. And so holding our boundary is one of the ways that we express our expectations and also hold our standards. But again, like within this particular dynamic, I'm trying to figure out how to do that compassionately if this is a relationship that I want to continue. So taking distance from a person, taking distance from a particular environment. So like maybe there's a particular place that you want to go, but they haven't worked on, for instance, like I'm thinking of Motion Pacific, which is this really lovely dance studio here in town in Santa Cruz. They have a list of how microaggressions aren't tolerated in their performance space. And so there's this idea that you feel safety immediately when you walk into a space, but not all movement spaces have that kind of really blatant, like microaggressions aren't allowed here. You're not allowed to harm other people in the space. And if you do accidentally harm somebody else, we have like an intentional accountability process that we go through. Some spaces make it really safe to enter that way, and some spaces don't feel safe. Like, you know, again, as a queer person, really recognizing what spaces feel queer friendly, for instance, and which ones I feel like I have to mask a little bit more my queerness because it doesn't feel as safe to be as out. Okay, so here's an example of a boundary, right? So I worked at a healing arts center for a long time as the manager. And in this healing arts center, you know, like it's kind of hippie, kind of crunchy granola, like cool, whatever, like partly my vibe for sure. But there's this culture there where you hug everybody the first time you meet them. You hug them every time you meet them, whether it's the first interaction or the 100th interaction. We don't shake hands, we hug. Like that was the culture there. And I'm somebody that doesn't hug people right away, right? And one of the things that I've been noticing during the pandemic that I've really appreciated is because we all have different risk thresholds, because we all have different vaccination statuses, because we all have different ideas about masking, we've had to get really clear with our consent. Do you want a hug right now? And that's something that I super value, that somebody's checking in with me about whether or not I want my body touched, how I want my body touched. And it doesn't have to be super formal. It can just be like, would you like a hug? And then I get to say yes or no. But saying no to somebody who's offering you a hug might hurt their feelings. And I don't necessarily want to hurt somebody's feelings. You know, sometimes I need to hold a firm boundary, you know, somebody just wants to press up against me. But often somebody's trying to extend, you know, like care and connection and camaraderie in some way. And then by me going, no, I come across as the bitch, right? Like that, like, why doesn't she, like, is she just unfriendly? No, I just have different touch preferences, right? I have different ways that I like to receive attention, especially on a first encounter. But like, it's hard hurting somebody else's feelings and seeing their disappointment and then watching them potentially shame spiral. Like, oh, is there something wrong with me? Does she not like me for some reason? So I just want to say, like, when we're holding our boundaries, there's this tender balancing act between enacting our preferences and also being compassionate towards everybody else, right? Being compassionate towards ourselves, being compassionate towards others. So I'm not saying holding boundaries is easy. Being proactive helps us hold our boundaries more easily. And one of the ways that we can be proactive is by knowing what our boundaries are. So for instance, if I was going into the hug situation and I didn't know that I was the kind of person that doesn't like to automatically hug on a first encounter, it would be harder for me to hold my boundary versus, let me tell y'all, I have so many repetitions in my body taking a step back or extending my hand or waving in some way as a way to indicate I'm friendly, I'm here, I want to communicate with you. Don't touch me. With love, don't touch me. And you know, like that's not always true, but you get what I'm saying. Also being able to clearly communicate what your boundary is. So for instance, you know, if I'm in a professional environment like managing a healing arts center, I don't necessarily want to hug everybody that's walking through the door. Is that still true at a party? Oh, well, I'm going to be honest. Yeah, it's still true at a party for me. But, you know, maybe it's different for some of you. And then this is tricky. This is tricky because your boundaries are allowed to change. Context to context, transaction to transaction, person to person, across time and space and distance and preferences. And there's also something around consistency, right? Where we know from studies that intermittent reinforcement is the most reinforcing thing. So doing something consistently is less reinforcing behavior-wise sometimes if it's intermittent. So think about if you're feeding the dog scraps from the table, right? So careful if you invite me into your house because likely I'm going to feed your dog scraps from the table. Like your dog's going to know that they can consistently get a yes from me. I'm not going to have a boundary around scraps. If you have a boundary around not feeding your dog scraps from the table, you're going to have to clearly communicate that with me. Hey, we don't feed the dog scraps from the table because as soon as you start feeding him, he's going to get confused and then he's going to be obnoxious begging all the time. And this is the same mechanism that works in casinos. You know, when you're pulling the slot lever, sometimes you might hit that jackpot, but most of the time you're not. But the fact that it's like you don't know when it's going to happen, like makes it really reinforcing. And by the way, our phones use the same technology. All the alerts that we get, all the text messages that come in, all the email notifications, most of them are like, yeah, okay, maybe work. Yeah, maybe spam, maybe this. And then every now and then our best friend like texts us with like the juiciest gossip, and we get this like huge hit, and then we're like checking our phones compulsively again after that, right? So being consistent in your boundaries can be helpful, but I'm not saying you have to always have the same boundary. But again, all of this is about clearly communicating, hey, this is always a boundary for me. This isn't going to change. Or I'm thinking about it in terms of like BDSM, right? Like when you go to like one of the play parties and like green is like, you can come and ask me anything. And yellow's like, proceed with caution. Like you can ask me questions, but I might say no. And red is that, don't touch me. I'm just here to watch. So it's a little bit like that with boundaries, right? Like when is the boundary super consistent? When is it a little bit more mutable? And how do you communicate that so everyone can consent and be on the same page? Okay, but when holding your boundary, please, please, please watch out for externalizing your boundary. And externalizing your boundary is what we do when we are trying to manage internal agitation externally by controlling our environment. And if any of you have tried this, you know it backfires like hell, right? Because what happens? Let's say you're externalizing your boundary. You make somebody else hold a boundary for you. Do you feel better? Maybe temporarily. You might like in the moment feel grateful that they loved you enough in order to sacrifice something that they wanted, right? But then that old anxiety comes back. And why is that? That is because, first of all, it doesn't feel great to keep somebody from doing something they want to do. Like, you know, they're rescuing you. You know, they're overextending themselves. And that doesn't feel great. We're like, shit, I know what you really want to do. And I know the only reason you're not doing it is because of me. That can make us feel really bad. It can also make us lose trust in ourselves and the other person. We lose trust in ourselves because we don't get an opportunity to show how resilient and capable we are about handling our dignified differences. And we lose trust in the other person because we feel like, shit, if I'm not the one that's staying on you, making sure that you hold this boundary, you're not going to hold it. And so we become hyper vigilant, right? So externalizing our boundaries, not the best. Okay. This is the part that can get a little heavy. What happens when somebody crosses our boundary? What do we do? So again, I'm saying I'm not a fan of persecution and punishment, but natural consequences are a real thing. So if somebody crosses your boundary, you might need to limit how much time you spend with that person, how much intimacy you share with that person, what kind of access they have to you, how much trust you give to them. So natural consequences are the results of you saying, hey, this is my limit. You didn't meet my minimum standard in some way. You crossed my threshold in some way. And now I need to go and take care of myself. And this holding the boundary really is about taking care of yourself, honoring what it is that you want and need, rather than worrying about the other person. This is really you turning the attention back to yourself. And you're not trying to get the other person to change when you're doing natural consequences, right? In the same way, like when you're punishing somebody, you might be trying to get them to change. Enacting natural consequences is about you honoring yourself, and the other person might decide to make different choices so they still have access to you, but that's not the goal. You know, that's kind of like a side effect of you just being really true to yourself and then people deciding whether or not your boundaries are worth the price of admission for continuing to relate with you. So boundaries can be really hard to hold. And boundaries can be really hard to hear because we have this idealism in the culture that if we love each other, that if we care about each other, we're going to think the same things. We're going to want the same things. We're going to have all the same preferences and interests and friends and worldviews. And I want to kill that Cinderella idealism, like kill that ideal. What is this? This is Julia Kelleher's, right? Kill your idealism before your idealism kills you. I want to have enough space in the relationship in my body for you to have enough space in your body that we can be completely ourselves with respect, with decency, that we don't have to be the same in order to treat each other with respect. But again, when we hold a boundary, if I'm saying holding a boundary is the moment that you move your body away from something or somebody, you're literally creating space. That can be tough on a relationship, especially a relationship that you want to feel close and connected to. So that can be tender. And making space for that sadness or that confusion. Like it makes me really tired when I have to hold a boundary with somebody that I love. I just feel heavy, and it's really tough, even though I know I'm doing what's best for me. And ultimately that means what's best for the relationship because I'm being honest about what I want and need. It's still really exhausting. The thing is being able to take care of yourself and hold your boundary and hold that grief of holding a boundary is actually what creates long-term sustainability for the relationship, because caving in, letting somebody cross your boundary, or somebody else letting you cross their boundary, like it might be a short-term solution, but it's long-term poison for the relationship. There's going to be so much resentment at the end of it. You're going to have overextended so much, so there's going to be nothing left to give at the end. How do we honor somebody else's boundaries? And this is going to be back to one of my favorite topics of conversation, intention versus impact. And so when we're thinking about, okay, let's say I didn't mean to cross your boundary. If you have that, like, I didn't mean to, that's really different. I'm sorry, but I didn't mean to is really different than I'm sorry and it won't happen again, right? So intention, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Impact, I'm sorry, it won't happen again. Those are two very different things. And when you're saying, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cross your boundary, what you're implying is that you're at the center of the story and how you're feeling is the most important thing. And when somebody's boundary has been crossed, it doesn't feel good for them to receive that kind of communication. It feels way better for them to receive something along the lines of, I'm sorry, that won't happen again, or I'm sorry, now you know how do we navigate this difference between us, so you can start centering the other person's experience so we can start dealing with that impact instead, right? And again, I'm all for autonomy and sovereignty and you taking care of yourself, but when we're talking about boundaries within relationships, if we're going to continue that relationship, honoring boundaries is going to be an important part of that. I don't get to tell other people what their boundaries are, and they don't get to tell me what my boundaries are. And that's because I have this cosmology, this worldview, that people are the experts of their own lives. I don't get to be the expert of anybody else's life besides my own. I get to be the expert of my life. I get to decide what's best for me. Because I'm on a particular journey, right? I'm pretty clear on my passions. I'm pretty clear on my purpose, my preferences. And as soon as I get information, I'm updating all of those things, but I'm enacting those things as much as possible. So I'm living the life that has the most meaning for me with the time I have here on the planet. And everybody else gets to decide that. They don't get to decide how you're spending your time and energy, and you don't get to decide how they're spending their time and energy. So where they're putting their attention, how they're interacting in their spaces, they get to decide that. And then by communicating that clearly, you can see, how to honor each other's boundaries. But I'm not going to make an assumption that somebody's journey is more or less important than mine or more or less valid than mine, right? So I may have a particular boundary that somebody else doesn't understand. They may not be, like, especially, the Enneagram 8 in me again. I'm just like, why aren't y'all holding more boundaries? Like, life is so good boundaried. But other people might not have the capacity, the skill set, or the desire or motivation. They might not think that they need to hold a boundary in the same way. And I'm a really big advocate of letting everybody choose for themselves what their boundaries are. So all we can do is honor our own precious vessels, to act in alignment with our own values, and to hold our boundaries. Thanks as always for listening. If you want more information, you can find me on Instagram at Be The Radical Way, and check out trendswithbenefits.com for all of our written work on psychedelics, well-being, and the human experience. Here's wishing you ease in all your explorations.